Andrew Rogers on the Barton organ. Thank you, Andrew. Welcome, everyone, to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. I see we still have a few people up here. Oh, and you lovely people who followed my request. Anyone who wants to come sit in the front center section, there's going to be a little interactive fun for people sitting there. So if you want to relocate there, I say do it. Today, we present renowned social practice artist Marisa Morán Jahn. This is presented in partnership with the Stamps Gallery, and it's also part of the 2019 Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Symposium. The MLK Symposium has a multitude of events happening across campus through the month of February, and I highly suggest that you check out the entire lineup, which you can find on the web at the U of M website. Just put in MLK Symposium. And there's lots of great stuff to come, and here we are today. This evening, there's an opening reception at the Stamps Gallery for The Mighty and the Mythic, which is a solo exhibition of the work by none other than our speaker this evening, and you're all invited. So rather than our regular Q&A that happens in the screening room at the end of the talks here on the main stage, instead we will all go down the road merrily directly to the gallery, which is on, what is it on? Division. It is just down the street on Division between Liberty and Washington. So go down Liberty to Division, take a right, and you'll find yourself at the Stamps Gallery, where we'll meet. There will be food, there will be refreshments, there will even be a DJ, Nandy Comer, and we'll also have an opportunity for a Q&A with Marisa. So don't miss that opportunity. And then tomorrow, another exhibition I wanted to mention. Friday, there's an opening reception at the Institute for the Humanities Gallery for the new show there featuring artist David Opdyke called Paved with Good Intentions, debuting the work of This Land, recently featured, many of you may have read this past week in the New York Times, an article about it by cultural critic Lawrence Weschler, who many years ago was also a penny stamp speaker. At 4 p.m., there's going to be a conversation with the artist, David Opdyke, exploring the power or lack thereof of art to address politically urgent issues and the effectiveness of socially driven art. And then the opening reception at 5 p.m. So 2 days you can get free dinner. Please remember to turn off your cell phones. And now for a few words of introduction of our guest, an artist, filmmaker, and writer of Ecuadorian and Chinese descent. Marisa Morán Jahn founded Studio REV, a nonprofit organization whose public art and creative media affects the lives of low-wage workers, immigrants, women, and youth. Key projects include El Bibliobandido, a masked story-eating bandit who terrorizes little kids to offer him stories they've written. Video Slink Uganda, experimental film slipped or slinked into Uganda's bootleg cinemas, and Contratados, a Yelp for migrant workers. As an artist in residence with the National Domestic Workers Alliance since 2012, Jahn co-created various projects that amplify the voices of America's fastest growing workforce, caregivers. 2 mobile studios, NannyVan, CareForce One, an app for domestic workers that CNN named one of 5 apps to change the world, and CareForce One Travelogues, a Sundance-supported docu-series for PBS. John's work has been reviewed by the New York Times, BBC, Univision, and Artforum, which describe John's work as exemplifying the possibilities of art as social practice. Her work has been awarded numerous grants and has exhibited at the White House, Museum of Modern Art, New Museum, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, Walker Art Center, and more. Please welcome Marisa Morán Jahn.
Hi. I first wanted to thank Christina Hamilton and also Srimoyi, Jennifer, Joe, and the Stamps crew who have been installing this exhibition that opens after the talk at 6:30. And I'm starting with a project that I did in 2004, and this is a set of wearable musical instruments. And you have to put it on, and you have to commit to it, and you tie it behind your waist, and then there's these chopped up harmonicas inside that you'll see in a second, and you have to push and pull, and so it allegorizes the push and pull of relationships. So what's interesting about how it was deployed was that it involves, it's working. For those of you guys who do interactive and participatory projects, even seeing it without having to don it, it draws some anxiety, provokes some anxiety in people. I will say that there's 3 couples I know who met through this project. And I also made the project with my collaborator of now 15 years. We were breaking up. This is 7 years ago. We were still best friends. So it also involves other people in kind of coaching, so someone will say, I don't know, kind of move in and out, find the right spot. So I really liked that project, and afterwards, I sought to think through, my work changed at that moment, afterwards, and I started a nonprofit called Studio REV, and I wanted to do interactive work, but that's creating impact outside in the larger public sphere. And we work as a team of artists, media makers, techies, low-wage workers, immigrants, and youth, and we create public art and creative media about the issues that we face. Contratados is a Yelp site for migrant workers where they can rank and rate their employers. And it serves also, the pull of the project is that workers want to come look for jobs. And these are the downloadable comics, and we also produced audio novellas with it. We've also produced a number of books. This is Byproduct, which is a book about artists embedded in industries, science, government, and corporations. Proagonist is a book about productive friction or agonism. It's written in, it's published in black and blue, the colors of a good bruise, and the half-inch hole is there so that agonism is about it's strife bound up with empathy. So if antagonism is about oppositionality, then agonism is about having a worthy opponent. And it's about embracing the other. The half-inch hole is there so that you can hold it up, and as you're reading, you're framing the other, and you're keeping them with you as you read along. So the projects that I'm going to go into more deeply, first is, well, a guiding North Star for me is Arabian Nights. So Arabian Nights is a frame tale that has other stories tucked in between. And it was written over many millennia by many women and over many continents. And so for me, it's something, it's an enigma, and it's amazing and beautiful. So for about 2 decades, I taught K through 12 in school and after school programs. And something that I feel like I loved to do and excelled at was teaching kids how to read. And I was using and drawing on Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And in my classroom, I, in particular, have focused on working with youth from historically under-resourced communities, and some of whom had challenges in reading because reading might not be their first language, for example. But if you use and leverage these other kinds of intelligences, then it helps people get unstuck and get excited about literacy. And a friend of mine who worked in this NGO in Honduras, she invited me to come do a bookmaking workshop. And she said, you have to come, I've told them about your work, and they're really excited. They have the largest library in northern Honduras. And so when I went there, I was astonished that their library was this large. And so my goal was to work with this community and create a way for our bookmaking workshop, which was quite successful, to stick. So this is the project that we created together. I'm often asked this question of how I define success in my work, and I feel like with this project, it's the stickiness of the framework that is exciting for different communities. And I have to tell you that I actually didn't know, so after we staged Bibliobandido, there's about a year and a half, and I didn't really hear from the organizers because they're in a really remote area. And I was talking to one of the organizers by phone, and she said, oh yeah, it's Bibliobandido week. And I was like, what's that? And then so she explained that the third week of every month is Bibliobandido week, and they'd been continuing it for a year and a half, and now it's been 8 years later. So some designers use the term white labeling to describe the adaptation of something by other users, and I feel like that's something that I do, it's a challenge that I take on and like to do in projects that involves movement building. For me, another signal that something is working is that the Seattle Public Library adopted Bibliobandido as the mascot for their digital media programs. And so you can see this project as an installation in the Stamps Gallery, which opens again at 6:30, and it's participatory. So switching to a different project, in the 1930s and 40s is when most workers got basic workplace rights. Farm workers and domestic workers were intentionally excluded at that time by Southern lawmakers. In the early 2000s, domestic workers in New York started sharing their stories with lawmakers in Albany, and they passed the nation's first domestic worker Bill of Rights. And this advocacy group approached me and asked me to collaborate and create new art and tools with them. So we first created an audio novella app, and then as the movement started growing, so now there's a domestic worker Bill of Rights in 8 localities throughout the United States. So this movement is growing, and to reach domestic workers where they're at, and also to create new tools and artwork, we created the NannyVan. So with my son and my team, we hit the road, and we would unpack in places to gather and share stories in places where domestic workers would go, so things like libraries or farmers markets or transit stops, for example. And along the way, as we're learning information about as domestic work is very regionally specific, we would create new tools along the way. So this is something like an employment poster. We created an album that remixes the songs of domestic workers with danceable techno music. And then we started choreographing these dances that they fold in information about the movement and make certain kinds of information mnemonically accessible. And then we created new digital works along the way as well. And this is our audience engagement plan. And it's how we as a team were mapping out the different pieces of information which were created for different kinds of audiences. So a lot of the work up until that point throughout the NannyVan's tenure was created domestic worker facing, so a lot of know your rights tools. And then I started thinking about the role of domestic employers, such as myself, in this movement. So when my son was born, I relied on a nanny in order to go back to work, and so I wanted to make sure that she was well cared for. And as I was looking for information about what resources are out there, I saw that there was a lack of information. So I started making new tools to make the information more visible. And I started using museums and galleries as places to inform or activate domestic employer audiences. So as one example, drawing from the language of WPA posters, which is the same moment when domestic workers were excluded, I created a series of silkscreen prints. And then we also worked with ITVS and PBS to produce a film series that is available on the web and also in the Stamps Gallery. And I'm going to share with you the first episode, which is 5 minutes long. If I can get to the cursor here. Sorry, hold on a second. Let me get here. There we go. My name's Marisa Jahn. I'm an artist, teacher, and a mom. This 1967 Mercury station wagon is the CareForce One, inspired by some of the incredible caregivers I've met. Like most working parents, I'm still figuring it out. This is Anja, my collaborator. We've been making artwork for years, and when my son Luca, aka Choco, was born, she helped me juggle things. She still does. You want to finish reading the book? My immigrant parents are in their 70s. They live across the country and don't have much of a safety net. I don't have the financial means to support them the way that I would like to. My most recent project is with domestic workers and advocates like Hijinks.
It is the work that makes all other work possible.
Our collaboration led to a project we call the CareForce, a movement that celebrates domestic workers and the people they care for. This is Guillermina. She recently founded one of the first worker-owned cleaning cooperatives in the Bay Area that's run entirely by Latina immigrant women. This is Narada, a Nepali-born organizer in New York City who helped pass the nation's first laws that give domestic workers basic workplace protections. And this amazing woman is Natalicia. Natalicia came as a teen from Brazil to work as a nanny in Boston, where she encountered horrific working conditions. After removing herself from that situation, she earned a PhD and now leads a nonprofit that advocates for the rights of Brazilian immigrants in New England. The CareForce One was a huge hit locally in New York City. Then one day I got a phone call from Miami. That sounds amazing. That sounds really exciting. Well, first of all, yes, I would love to bring the CareForce car there in Miami. I mean, he gets a little car sick, and I technically haven't driven the car long of a distance, but I think we're just gonna have to make it work. So Anja, Choco, and I are going on an adventure from New York City to Miami to lead a day of celebration with and for some of our domestic worker friends at a world-class museum.
There is one problem.
We left the lights on.
We don't know nothing about cars.
The battery's totally dead.
Yeah, what is CareForce One? Do you know?
It's the fastest one in the whole world.
We work with caregivers. It's the fastest growing workforce. I'm going down a one-way street. I hope you'll join us as we navigate car issues. Hold on. And care issues. And find solutions to both from the amazing people we meet along the way.
Bravo, bravo!
Yay! Thank you! Next up, we travel to DC to meet a caregiver who is fighting injustice in unexpected ways. zoom ahead a little bit. And so in the next project that I'll share with you, as you can see, I'm often working with different organizations and NGOs and movements to create these projects. And I had an studio mate, office mate, who ran this NGO that's based in Uganda. And they're a human rights and media advocacy organization. And when I met them, they were creating these PSAs, these video PSAs, and the way that they would distribute them was that they would slip and slink, I say slink them onto the forepart of a commercially pirated DVD so that before you see Terminator 2, you see a 2-minute video about Zika, for example. And I was fascinated by what they were doing and asked them more about the media college in Uganda, and they were describing how viewers watch multiple screens at once, and also how most of the films came in were commercial, and there was not alternative perspectives. And Uganda is a place where there is a fair amount of censorship. So they have homophobic laws. There's colleagues of ours in Uganda who've been thrown in jail, for example, for having a play with a gay man as one of the protagonists. So it's considered not free, partly free by media, by the media world. So this is the project that we created in which we were introducing alternative perspectives with diasporan filmmakers, and using art, which allows people to share different kinds of edgier perspectives and allows things to fly under the radar. And when you see someone catching a stone, then cheer, okay? So in our second collaboration, I was thinking about what I would they said, well, why don't you slink a video on yourself that you've created, a video you've created? And I started thinking about, well, gosh, well, what is my relationship to this community in Uganda, other than incidentally having this office mate and being interested? And I started noticing that there was these posters of Bruce Lee throughout, outside of video halls, and I was asking my collaborator about it, and he said, well, it's as if it was the U.S. in the 1970s and 80s. People love Bruce Lee. And I am Chinese Ecuadorian. I grew up in Texas. Bruce Lee, for me, I felt like was a personal ambassador who many people are equally inspired by. And I started fixating on this image of from Enter the Dragon. And if you are familiar with this film, Bruce is getting busted up by his enemy, and he then recalls this sentence from his sensei, who says something like, to defeat the enemy, you must defeat the illusion. And I started thinking about, well, does that mean that truth is opposed to illusion, or what is this saying? And I thought that, for me, truth inheres in the other. And I started thinking about whether I could then put a mirror onto another and see myself reflected. But there's also a distortion that takes place too, right? So this was my first experiment of these mirrored masks in we see ourselves reflected. And mirrors are something that have been of interest to artists for forever. This is Van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, the wonderful mural Euclides trash can in which you, as someone discarding your trash, is implicated. And I also was really interested in this idea of the mask as allowing us to explore liminality, or this betwixt and between. And so this is the video that I created with my Ugandan collaborators. So that's a work in progress that will slink onto the next round of bootlegs. We started creating these, while a lot of my projects are these things that take place and unfold, over many, many years, Video Slink for me, and with the Mirror Mask project in particular, was something that I could do, and it's these very short but intense engagements with, in collaboration with other people. This project, this photograph, a lot of the content that we're thinking about are these transitional moments between life and death. Here we thought of, like the haircut, for example, proverbial transitional moment when you're becoming something else. In this one, we're drawing influence from in Greek mythology, in which, and there's many other cultures as well, in which there's a character who's ferrying you, transporting you between life and afterlife. And when we showed this in the museum in Salt Lake City, Utah, it was placed next to a mummy, which is really exciting. So here's some of the other photos as well. And I was working on this project over the summer in preparing for the show in Utah. A friend of mine who's Kazakh, we were looking at a map and she was telling me where she's going. I was like, oh man, if you ever need company, I'll come with you. And she's like, well, why don't you come along? I said, well, I have to work on this thing. And so she said, well, why don't you just come along on my family vacation? So I came along as the fourth wheel, and then the family gets involved, and we essentially are going to different places in Central Asia. And it becomes a conversation with her and her daughters about the politics and the history of specifically Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where their family's from. And we're creating these vignettes, and they're kind of improvisatory in the sense that sometimes I'm making the masks from soup to nuts, but other times I'm coming with some masks, and they're kind of mostly made, and we decide on the vignette, and we create them together. We went on a tour to this lake, and this is our tour guide who got involved in the project as well, and so here he is again. We went to Azerbaijan and met up with a fellow artist, Faik Ahmed, and another place where there's censorship issues. Art can fly under the radar, and in this portrait, actually the titling on the bottom is wrong. It's not Sultan who's it featuring. The person wanted to be anonymous because it's a as a Muslim, he wouldn't want to be normally seen without a shirt off. So here again, the mask is liberatory by the very fact that it's concealing. So the final project I'm going to share with you is a work in progress. And I make videos as research investigations. And this is the first part of that.
We analyzed rarely seen government records. They show women have been reporting problems with the Mirena IUD for years.
Shit. Was that the IUD that I had?
I searched my medical records and was relieved to find that my IUD was a different model and make. And while I know that the IUD is like in my snatch and stuff, I looked on the internet to find out exactly where it goes. That got me remembering a conversation I'd had with my gynecologist.
So, what's your contraception plan after you give birth?
I don't know. But all I know is that I'm hella fertile.
Ever try the copper IUD?
Nope. What does the copper do?
Well, it's a small device that goes into the uterus. The copper acts as a spermicide.
Whoa! Copper ions are zapping the sperm?
Well, we don't really know what's happening with the copper. The ions are doing their thing, but it has a 99% effective rate. Around the world, it's been more popular. 41% of Chinese women use it, 23% of French women, 27% of Norwegian women, and it's gaining popularity in the US.
Okay, sure. Anything except for the pill. So after the birth of my son, the thing got popped in. And now, looking at these headlines, I couldn't stop thinking about those copper ions. They're everywhere. Cities, homes, computers, and of course the Earth. But where exactly on this planet did my copper ions come from? Like, which copper mine? Did some person have to blow up a mountain to get the copper that goes in my cooch?
I mean, I get to say what goes in my cooch, and I want it to stay that way for me and the 170 million women with invisible copper antenna uniting us. I like knowing these copper ions are guarding me from getting prego. Family planning, baby. Copper makes loving even better. Imagine that times 170 million, all at the same time.
So this is Gustave Courbet's Origin of the World, which is Glenn Lowry from the MoMA described it as one of the most erotically charged paintings, and it's a symbol of the male gaze because we can't even see the face of the subject. And my version of this one is about female desire, of course, that we're given a libidinal freedom when we have reproductive choices. I also want to say that one other thing, this is important for the pop quiz that's later, one other thing that copper is in is lightning rods, which I thought was, okay, so that pop quiz later. So this project is a book and a film and a public art project, and it's about reproductive technology, but it's equally a story about extraction and sustainability and self-determination, who has the right to make what kinds of choices. And I've started to research copper, which was first mined in 8000 BCE on the island of Cyprus, home of Venus of Aphrodite, which is how they share the same alchemical symbol. That was later taken up by the women's liberation movement. Copper has been used in contraceptive devices for millennia, and most recently it was used in IUDs starting in the late 1960s. So contraception advocates like Margaret Sanger saw the IUD as a tool to liberate women and encourage pleasure, but by the 60s and 70s, corporations, population control advocates, and NGOs positioned the IUD as an essential sterilization device that could control America's low-income, indigenous, and immigrant communities and solve the population bomb of the global South. Millions of women were given the IUD without their consent or economically incentivized to accept the IUD. But many of these women, especially in patriarchal societies where they felt it wasn't safe to openly challenge their husbands, saw the IUD as an invisible, long-term contraception device that gave them the ability to control their bodies and lives. Problematically, one of the IUDs used by the 2.5 million women was the plastic Dalkon Shield, released on the market in 1971 without adequate testing. The device's multi-filament string carried bacteria from the vagina into the uterus, which led to an increased likelihood of infections, septic abortions, and infertility. 18 women died, 200,000 reported serious injuries. After 12,000 lawsuits and mass uproar, the Dalkon Shield was finally pulled off the market in the 1980s, and the pharmaceutical company went bankrupt. Since that time, scientific advances have improved the safety of the IUD, and in the early 2000s, after memories of the Dalkon Shield had faded, the copper IUD was reintroduced to moms in the global north, like me, as a means of family planning, which brings us to today. A week after Trump was elected, Planned Parenthood saw a 900% rise in women requesting IUDs, a contraception that would outlast his presidency. Uncertainty in the Supreme Court also drove up the number of IUD users, as did the Supreme Court confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. While anti-choice conservatives attempt to rewrite science and scientists push back, advocacy organizations around the world are doubling down on campaigns that affirm the right to choose. And repro justice organizations continue the focus on ways that women of color have traditionally faced economic and systemic barriers in gaining access to contraceptive technology. So against the complex history of the IUD and its bright future, the IUD for many of us today is a tool enabling self-determination, and this is something that I want to monumentalize through public art sculpture. I want to make visible this thing that's normally physically and discursively invisible. So Klaus Oldenburg makes these large-scale pop art sculptures of quotidian American objects. But rather than large, an innocuous object, as Oldenburg does in his public sculptures of pies, ice cream cones, and other America quotidiana, I want to create a giant IUD sculpture, or what I'm calling ZAP, which is instantly recognizable to millions of women, but in fact, precisely because men and many younger women will not recognize the sculpture as a reference, ZAP invites women who do recognize the object's reference to become interlocutors of the project, placing their stories, their desire, and their hard-won victories for reproductive choice at the center of the project. Soaring into the sky like a secular feminist version of Christ the Redeemer, ZAP boldly responds to today's political climate. And I'm letting you know this because I'm looking for a site to build ZAP. And 7 degrees of separation, I know you will know someone who knows someone or an organization that needs ZAP on their site. And this brings us to the close of our frame tale, which is bookended by desire in cahoots with justice. So, 2 housekeeping notes. One is that the opening reception is at 6:30 in the Stamps Gallery, and then this Saturday is a film screening where you can see all the episodes of the CareForce One Travelogues, and there will also be members from Michigan United. And then in closing, I would like you guys, those of you guys sitting in the middle front rows have a, like a party favor, I don't know what you can call it, a special CareForce mask under your chair. And this is our participatory experiment. So what I'd like you to do is, and if we can have the house lights on, is actually, so raise your hand if you have ever been a babysitter or a nanny or a housekeeper. Okay, great. Wow, lots of people. Raise your hand if you are a domestic employer, which means, okay, statistically, there's 2.5 to 5 million domestic workers, nannies, housekeepers, and caregivers across the country. There's like 79 million there's 79 million parents across America, many of whom are struggling to find care because there's not enough there's not enough babysitters and nannies out there. Raise your hand if you are a domestic employer or have been. Okay, now raise your hand if you have a relative who, like it could be your grandma who will soon need care, or you might have someone who's disabled in your family. Raise your hand if you have someone in your family who needs care. Okay, now raise your hand if you're if you have taken care of someone in your family before, and it might be compensated, but it's also not compensated. So this new term that we're coming up with, family caregivers. Okay, so there's 20 million family caregivers across the United States. So really we're all implicated in the care crisis because care starts in the beginning of life, and hopefully maybe we all have dignified care at the end of our lives. So you're all implicated, and now you're part of the care force. What I'd like to ask you to do is for everyone to stand up, and those of you guys with the mask, so if everyone can stand up, and then with your free hand, you are going to put the mask up like this, and then with your Your other hand, you are going to give me your best superhero pose. Okay? And you can say CareForce. 1, 2, 3. CareForce! Awesome. Thank you, guys.